comic books, films, books, video games, horror, fantasy, and science fiction. These all represent samples of our contemporary mythology. They are considered valid forms of communication. It is how we see this content in our everyday lives that it could help us to understand events and stories of the past. My name is Lawrence Nadell. I'm the creator and instructor of the Contemporary Mythology course at Veritas Academy. I'm here to share with you my journey and how I was able to utilize the SCM model to design a new interactive course for our students. Throughout my career thus far, I have consistently tried to incorporate my interests in comic books, films, and video games into my daily lessons as a high school history teacher. However, I have also been interested in developing a course based on my passion for all areas in pop culture. It became my goal and determination that I develop such a course that would never be called contemporary mythology. Now, what is our goal here? We want to utilize the SCM model to design a course that teaches our students about the mythology and history of all areas in pop culture. This can include, but not limited to, comic books, films, video games, and books and novels. Now, before I continue, I must emphasize a word of caution. When instructing this course, it is going to be probable that the instructor is going to want to show content to the students that contains explicit language and content and material. Therefore, it is vital that the instructor receives permission both from the administration and the parents or guardians of the students before showing such content. Now, why would we choose to conduct the class this way? In contemporary mythology, there are numerous characters that exist that contain extraordinary abilities. In ancient civilization, we would refer to these characters as gods. However, in today's day and age, we do not refer to them as gods. We refer to them as superheroes. It is up to us as educators to find a way to teach this material to our students that contains rich literacy and messages. Now, why do I feel that this course even needs to exist? Is there even a blueprint for it? And more importantly, is there a precedent for it? And the answer is yes, there is a precedent for it. In the 1970s, at the University of Indiana, there was an experimental program, and the deal was this. The university allowed graduate students to make proposals on courses that they would want to teach. A young individual by the name of Michael Uslan decided to propose teaching the world's first accredited course on comic books. The dean looked at him and said that comic books were cheap entertainment and could not be taught in an academic institution. However, the dean also said that he appreciated what Mr. Uslan was doing and that when growing up, Superman was his favorite. So Uslan challenged this. He asked the dean if he knew of the story of Moses. The dean said yes. So he asked the dean to recite the origins of Moses. The dean went on to say that the ancient Egyptians were slaughtering the firstborn Hebrew males, and that mother and father put their infant son into a wicker basket, which was sent down the Nile until it was discovered by an Egyptian family who raised the baby as their own, and he grew up to be this great hero to his people. Uslan said, that sounds great. He then said, you used to read Superman comics? The dean said, yeah, I used to read them all the time. He asked, can you recite the origins of Superman? And said, sure. Planet Krypton was going to explode, and a scientist and his wife put their infant son into a rocket ship, which is sent off through Earth into space, where it lands on Earth, where he's discovered by the Kents, who raise him as their own, and he grows up to be this great. The dean abruptly pauses, looks at Uslan, and says, your course is accredited. What this moment signified was that comic book characters contained the same level of importance as mythological characters of ancient civilizations. It should be noted that Michael Uslan would eventually go on to become an executive producer for Warner Brothers and DC Comics. In July of 2016, I actually had the opportunity to meet Michael Uslan at the San Diego Comic-Con. I explained who I was and that I teach in a Renzulli school and specialize in this course. While he praised me for what I was doing, he actually asked me if Renzulli stood for Joseph Renzulli. I, of course, said yes. Turns out there is a connection between Dr. Renzulli and Michael Uslan. In fact, Dr. Renzulli made note of it in his keynote address last year. Now, in order to become a teacher, most people need to go to college and earn a degree in teaching a specific discipline. However, the knowledge for contemporary mythology really doesn't come from an academic institution. Some colleges will teach some liberal courses, but most really don't go as in-depth as they should. Instead, most of the knowledge of contemporary mythology comes from one's own personal life and interest. Ever since I was a little boy, I've always had a fascination with superheroes, comic books, films, and video games. When growing up, Batman, the Ninja Turtles, and the Power Rangers were my favorite. However, I was also interested in learning how these characters were developed, the process in making films based off their mythologies, and the history of the film industry and the comic book industry. My knowledge for contemporary mythology also stems from other areas. One of the other areas that has allowed me to engage my students in this course goes back to my years of experience in working in the haunted attraction industry. My experience in this industry allowed me to advance my knowledge and skills surrounding live events, set and costume design, special effects makeup, and acting. My interests have also manifested themselves in allowing me to become a professional attendee at conventions across the country. Some of the conventions that I've routinely attended over the last 10 years include the New York Comic-Con, the San Diego Comic-Con, Icon, Wizard World, Eternal Con, the Big Apple Con, and Monster Mania. These conventions also served as a gateway for me to become a collector of toys, comics, and rare collectibles. Now, in order to understand how the contemporary mythology course is structured, it is vital to remove any misconception that this course only focuses on comic books. While comic books are a major area that is analyzed, it is not the sole component. The course is thereby broken down into a series of units based on the different areas of pop culture. Each unit was designed to last a series of several weeks, and each unit specifically took place at key points throughout the school year. The timing of when these units took place was based on when key events took place throughout the world that they would coincide with. An example of this would be our unit on Star Wars, which took place from the end of November through December to coincide with the release of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Another example would be our unit on horror, which took place in October to coincide with Halloween. And then our unit on conventions took place from the end of September through early October to coincide with the New York Comic-Con, which takes place every year on Columbus Day weekend. The outline of the contemporary mythology curriculum will fluctuate year after year. And once again, this is based on the sequence of events that takes place throughout the year to give those units relevance. So next year, the course may look very different based on when the events take place, to which they correspond with what units we're going to be teaching. Now, what does a typical daily class look like in contemporary mythology? Students will come to class and they will begin working on their do now. They will have 5 minutes to work on the do now. And it is 5 minutes because we utilize a digital timer that is used through Weebly and Google. During this time, the teacher will take attendance and check for any items that may be due, projects, assignments. The do now consists of students completing a quick sketch in their sketch pads. By having the sketch pad in class, that itself serves as a grade. Students are free to draw whatever they wish as long as there is meaning to it. However, a student can work on perfecting the same drawing day after day. So an example of this would be, let's say a student wants to work on drawing the perfect Batman symbol. They can, as long as they see that progression and growth day after day. This will then transition into our activity for the day, which is based on what part of the unit we're in. So if we're at the beginning of a unit, we may have a lesson on the history of that unit. If we're in the middle of the unit, we may be analyzing a film that contains supplemental questions the students need to complete. And if we're at the end of the unit, we may be completing, or we will be completing, a post-assessment, such as a film review, an argumentative essay, or a project that requires the students to work individually and sometimes in groups. For the purposes of this year, our course was based on an introduction and then 9 units. In our introduction, students were informed that, once again, the course does not only focus on comic books, and they were introduced to a web of units that we would be exploring throughout the year. We then gave them the opportunity to have an initial assessment of their drawing skills, where they each drew that of the same image. They drew the Shredder from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In fact, the image that you're seeing on the screen is what our students actually drew. That's the actual image.
Wow.
From there, we went on to work on anatomical sketching techniques, including learning about the arms, the chest, the muscles, shadows, capes. To help our students develop a deeper understanding of different styles of animation, they then were allowed to analyze 2 styles of animation by watching Batman the Animated Series and Spider-Man the Animated Series from the 1990s. The goal of this was to compare and contrast the different styles of animation. They then learned about the major history that exists for the comic book industry, specifically by learning about why the names Bob Kane and Bill Finger are so important. These are the individuals that have been credited with the development of Batman. However, while Bob Kane has always been credited with the development of Batman, it has only been in recent years that Bill Finger has also been credited as well. Our next major unit was on conventions. Once again, this unit took place throughout early September through early October to coincide with the New York Comic Con. We began this unit by touching on live events, specifically through the WWE World Wrestling Entertainment. While this has been a type of entertainment that has been disputed by some as being fake, it is a type of entertainment that is also able to attract specific viewers, both male and female. Students also learned that the wrestlers themselves are able to portray their appearances to resemble that of heroes and villains. Examples of this would be John Cena and Paul Heyman. We then went into analyzing the different aspects surrounding conventions, specifically why cosplayers feel the need to go to the conventions dressed up as their favorite heroes or villains. A cosplayer, by definition, is someone that devotes a lot of time, money, and effort into designing their own costume to where they actually realistically look like the character they're portraying. To help understand this and analyze this, students viewed photos that I myself have taken both from the New York Comic Con and the San Diego Comic Con. They then focused on the fascination of people going to conventions in order to obtain rare collectibles, toys, and comics for value. To help illustrate this, students analyzed an episode of The Toy Hunter where a man by the name of Jordan Hembrook travels across the country in search of rare comics, collectibles for value as a business. And then finally, our students also analyzed why people go to conventions in order to meet celebrities, to obtain their autographs and photographs. For our next unit, students focused on horror. It was important for our students to understand why this unit was relevant to contemporary mythology. In today's day and age, many horror characters are being given their own comic book adaptations, such as Chucky, the Predator, and Dracula. In addition, there are conventions that now exist that are devoted only to the area of horror. Such conventions include Monstermania, which is usually in New Jersey and Maryland, and Monsterpalooza, which takes place in Los Angeles, California. In order for our students to fully understand how we analyze the unit of horror, it was important for them to break down the unit into a series of periods based on when films were released throughout the last century. We began our analysis by looking at the black and white Universal horror films of the 1930s, where we see Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and the Mummy. We then turned our attention to looking at the Hitchcock films of the 1960s through Psycho. In looking at the horror films of the early 70s, students focused on the fascination regarding the existence of the devil through such films as Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen. When looking at the horror films of the late 70s through early 90s, one of the specific areas students focused on was the concept known as the supernatural boogeyman. Specifically, the individual that can't be killed that chases young adults and adolescents into the woods and wherever. To help understand the students, we're able to analyze films such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, and Hellraiser. In looking at the horror films of the 1990s, it was important for students to break down that period into two subunits, 1990 to 1995, and then 1996 to 2000-2001. While the horror films of the early 90s have been depicted as being generally good and strong, the horror films of the late 90s have been depicted by some to be generally weak. This is due to some of the films having little or no supernatural elements in them, such as Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. However, there were some successful films in the late 90s, such as The Blair Witch Project. As we look into the 2000 period, pretty much from 2000 to 2010, we see a reemergence of strong horror films and franchises, such as Final Destination, The Ring, The Grudge, and the Saw films. And in recent years, pretty much over the last 8 years, we've seen an emergence of remakes of older horror films for current audiences. While some of these remakes can be considered complete failures, like A Nightmare on Elm Street, others can be considered bold successes, such as Fright Night, Evil Dead, and most recently, It. In looking at the horror films of the late 70s through 90s, where we discussed the supernatural boogeyman, one of the areas students were informed to pay extreme close attention to was the film company New Line Cinema. New Line Cinema has been often referred to as the house that Freddy built. This is due to the financial success that the Nightmare on Elm Street films have had. To help understand this, students analyzed and viewed a documentary titled Never Sleep Again, which details how the Nightmare on Elm Street films were made and the influence of their success both for New Line Cinema as a studio and the horror film franchise itself. To help articulate our students' understanding of this unit, they were then tasked with completing a formative essay titled The Evolution of Horror Films. In this essay, they detail how horror films have evolved over the periods we have discussed, and then made an argument citing which period was most innovative in scaring the audience. In our next unit, students analyzed DC Comics. Specifically, the reason this unit took place at this time, pretty much in November, was to correspond with the film The Justice League. We began this unit by looking at the history of DC Comics, specifically through the different eras, the Golden, the Silver, and the Bronze Ages. We then looked at the character of Superman, specifically the mythology that is contained within the character, going back to the Judeo-Christian mythology of God sending Christ, his only son, to save humanity, compared to Jor-El sending his only son, Kal-El, or Superman, to save humanity. Students also analyzed one of the most inspirational, groundbreaking comic book stories that has existed in the last 30 years, the death of Superman. And then, our students unfortunately became aware of the urban legend surrounding the Superman curse. This speaks about the belief that there is some sort of curse among people, actors who portray Superman, such as George Reeve and Christopher Reeve. We then turned our attention to looking at Batman. In looking at Batman, students were tasked with analyzing how the character has evolved since May of 1939. While the character was initially debuted as a dark and brooding vigilante, his depiction pretty much changed in the mid-60s with the television shows being campy and comedic. However, Batman would re-embrace his dark roots in the 80s through such comics as Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke. One of the other areas regarding Batman that our students were advised to pay close attention to was why the 1989 Batman film is considered to be so important. To help understand this, students viewed and analyzed a documentary titled basically the cinematic journey of bringing the Dark Knight to film or cinema. In this documentary, it talked about the painstaking effort it was to make Batman into a dark and serious film at the time. While our students were able to analyze the 1989 Batman film, they were initially supposed to compare it to the first Superman film directed by Richard Donner. However, in going back to the SEM model, we gave our students a choice. They can either compare it to Superman, or they'd be allowed to analyze the second Tim Burton Batman film, Batman Returns, from 1992. Our students actually chose to view Batman Returns. In doing so, they changed the purpose of the task. After they viewed the second Tim Burton Batman film, Batman Returns, they were then tasked with thinking about which Tim Burton Batman film is actually considered to be darker, which has actually been a very heated debate since the early 90s. For our next unit, students focused on Star Wars. Once again, this unit became relevant from late November through December because of the release of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. We began this unit by looking at the ancient mythology that is contained within the Star Wars films. Specifically, going back to the work of Joseph Campbell and what he calls the hero's journey. According to Campbell, the hero journey focuses on how an individual discovers who they are, meets a mentor, forms a relationship with allies, and then overcomes personal challenges. Students also focused on the political influences that come from Greece and Rome that are echoed in the Star Wars films. Specifically, how does a democracy become a totalitarian regime? This is echoed in the Star Wars films when Palpatine turns the Galactic Republic into the Empire and proclaims himself Emperor. Students then focused on how Star Wars has influenced pop culture and cinema, specifically through the work of George Lucas and his companies Lucasfilm, THX, Industrial Light and Magic, and Skywalker Sound. Lucas has been able to revolutionize how films have been made through digital technology and have inspired other filmmakers such as Steven Spielberg in Jurassic Park and Peter Jackson in The Lord of the Rings. While our students were able to analyze the first 3 films from the original trilogy and the documentary Empire of Dreams, the assessment that demonstrated their understanding of this unit came when they were instructed to work together to construct and build a new droid that we haven't seen before. Students decided to build and base their model of the droid on a pyramid scheme. In essence, they built an Imperial droid that would serve the Empire. In addition to the actual droid, they were tasked with providing the blueprints and the schematics of how the droid was built, what it specifically mathematically would look like, and also the tools and resources that were used in its construction. Our next unit brought us to the fascination of extraterrestrials. The reason we developed this unit at this time was to coincide with the next Cloverfield film, which pretty much took place in February. Extraterrestrials have been a major fascination and phenomenon in contemporary mythology over the last 40 to 50 years with such films as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, Cloverfield, and Men in Black. However, for our students to fully understand the influences of extraterrestrials, it was important for them to divide it up into good aliens versus bad aliens. In looking at good aliens, one of the major areas students were advised to pay attention to Was E.T. the extraterrestrial? While our students were able to understand that E.T. was left on Earth and wants to go home, they were able to understand the major influences that are contained within the E.T. film. Specifically, there is a scene in E.T. where E.T. is trick-or-treating with Elliot and his brother. And in one specific scene, he runs into a child dressed up like Yoda from Star Wars. This was purposely put in by Spielberg as an homage to his friend George Lucas, who had recently had great success with the second installment in the Star Wars saga, The Empire Strikes Back. In fact, if you listen to that scene, if you watch that scene and you listen carefully, you will hear Yoda's theme being played by John Williams. Our next major area, in terms of bad aliens that we looked at, gave our students an opportunity to analyze the biology surrounding the xenomorphs from aliens. Students were able to learn about the different evolutionary aspects of how this character, how this extraterrestrial develops. It begins with a queen that is able to lay these eggs. Each egg contains a parasite in it, known as a facehugger. When a host species comes close to one of these eggs, the facehugger will emerge and attempt to attach itself to the host's face, thereby implanting an embryo into the host's chest. During this time, the embryo will take on traits and characteristics of the host alien, of the host species. Example that our students learned about in Alien 3, the xenomorph was born of a dog and thereby decided and felt comfortable to walk in a quadrupedal position or on four legs. In fact, in that film, it has been referred to as the runner. The embryo inside the host's chest will eventually burst out, kill the host, and gradually grow in assisting in spreading the growth of the hive for more xenomorphs. Initially, this is where our unit would have ended. But we felt something was missing. Throughout the year, I had wanted to do a unit on Star Trek because I did one on Star Wars, and I needed to find the right place for it. It occurred to me that in the Star Trek universe, there are numerous amounts of extraterrestrial species that are analyzed. Therefore, we decided to do a mini unit on the extraterrestrial species surrounding Star Trek. We began this unit by providing an overview of how Star Trek is different from Star Wars. Specifically, Star Wars utilizes mythological elements and takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. However, Star Trek takes place in the 23rd and 24th century when mankind has become part of this universal group known as the United Federation of Planets. It has also been able to journey to other parts of the universe through technology known as warp drive. In analyzing the different extraterrestrial species that exist in Star Trek, students focused on, specifically, the Klingon Empire, the Romulans, the Ferengi, the Bajoran, the Vulcans, and the Borg. We then turned our attention to focusing on the fascination of people who devote their entire lives to Star Trek. They are often referred to as Trekkies. These are individuals that will devote their entire life to the point where they will wear Starfleet uniforms daily, learn Klingon as a real language, and decorate their houses to look like the USS Enterprise. In thinking about what film we would want our students to analyze regarding this unit, this mini-unit actually, we chose to have our students view Star Trek First Contact. The reason this film was chosen versus others is because this serves almost as an origin story to where students can learn how did mankind first discover it was not alone in the universe and learn how to better itself. When looking at our next major unit, students focused on the tragedy and diversity that is contained within comics. It was foreseen that some of the content we would be analyzing in contemporary mythology would be difficult to absorb. Some of it would be very, very difficult. Two specific areas we felt needed to be talked about and discussed included the tragic death of actor Heath Ledger, who portrayed the Joker in The Dark Knight, and the theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, where a gunman went into a crowded theater that was showing the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. When it came time to looking at diversity issues in comics, we then turned our attention to the X-Men. The diversity issues that are contained within X-Men echo back to the civil rights issues that we see in the 1960s. Specifically, mutants, who are people born with extraordinary abilities and powers, are denied basic human rights and discriminated against. Students also learned the similarities that exist between civil rights leaders Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, compared to characters Professor Xavier and Magneto. Students were then given the opportunity to analyze the first 8 episodes of X-Men the Animated Series from the 90s. In doing so, they learned about the Sentinel Program and the Mutant Control Registration Act that echoes back to the Japanese internment camps of the Second World War. To assess our students' understanding of this unit, students completed the diversity essay, where they were tasked with typing a 2-page essay on comparing the diversity issues that they see in the X-Men and comparing them and contrasting them to the diversity issues that we have seen in real life. In analyzing our next unit, which is on international influences, initially the course was called Contemporary American Mythology. But after thinking about the fact that our course analyzes areas of pop culture from across the world, it became evident to us that we need to change the course. Therefore, the course became known as just Contemporary Mythology. In looking at the international influences, we focused on Japan, specifically 2 areas. One of those areas is known as the Sentai series. This has been watched by children in the United States since 1993. However, they don't know it as the Sentai series. They know it as the Power Rangers. The Power Rangers were brought to the United States by a man known as Haim Saban, whose goal was to Americanize the show. Students were provided with an overview of the first 2 seasons of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. They also became aware of the major storyline differences within the Sentai series compared to the American version. One specific difference focused on the storyline surrounding the Green Candle. In the Sentai series, the Green Candle is designed to kill the Green Ranger. In the American version, the Power Rangers, the Green Candle is just designed to strip the Green Ranger of his powers. Students were then given the opportunity to analyze the first